Hello everyone, I'm Emily Freeman and I manage the Treasure Trove unit. For this presentation, I'm going to go through what the TTU has been up to during the pandemic and then have a look at some of the really exciting finds from Highland from the past couple of years. First, I wanted to start off by talking about what TT is, what Treasure Trove is. For those of you who do not know, and for those who may have heard of it, I just wanted to reiterate the legal system that we are working within. So in Scots common law, ownerless property belongs to the Crown, including portable antiquities. So artefacts found through activities like metal detecting or field walking, or if you find artefacts through gardening, or if you're walking the dog or walking on the beach, or if you are part of organised archaeological excavation, all of these finds legally must be reported as potential treasure trove. There are no limitations on age or material for what should be reported, rather it just needs to be deemed ownerless. Landowners have no property rights to portable antiquities, nor do sponsors of organised archaeological fieldwork have any claim to any of the finds made during their projects. In Scotland, the Crown's representative is the Queen's and Lord Treasurer's remembrancer, and that's who we work for. The day-to-day running of the Treasure Trove process is by the Treasure Trove unit, based at National Museum Scotland and funded by Scottish Government. Until very recently, we were a team of two, myself and my colleague Ella Paul, who is the Treasure Trove officer, but we were really excited that despite the pandemic, we had a third member of staff added to our team, a full-time permanent post, and Sophie Flynn, pictured here on the right, is our new Treasure Trove officer. So here we are a small team and we deal with the whole of Scotland. Now, usually you would find us in our office working through cases. We take every object reported to us and assess, first of all, whether it needs to be recorded. Some objects might be modern or bits of tractor, and we don't need to do anything with those. For everything else, we will do some research, we'll try to identify the objects, we'll take photographs, we will record measurements, and more importantly, we will have a look at the find spot. And that's all the information that we will be recording about that object, whether it is claimed or disclaimed. Now, as a team, we will then discuss whether the object should be disclaimed and returned to the finder, or whether it should be claimed, which would mean giving museums the opportunity to acquire the artefact. Of course, like many of you, I'm sure, we've been working from home since March 2020. And although we now have some access to the office, it is still on a limited basis, although it has started to increase. Until fairly recently, we've only been in 2 days a week, with one of those days dedicated to meeting with finders at the National Museum of Scotland. It has meant that, unfortunately, finds that were handed in before the pandemic haven't been processed. That was interrupted when we went into initial lockdown. And because we've had limited access to the office, we not only haven't been able to take in new finds very often, we've also not been able to process the finds we currently have as quickly as we would want to. Also, in normal times, we would be conducting outreach. So we would be travelling across Scotland, holding finds days and giving talks. And you can see a picture of one of those events on the slide here. We visited one of the local metal detecting clubs in Edinburgh. And usually I would be at the Highland Archaeology Festival conference and spend a weekend chatting to finders. This just hasn't been possible. So again, although we're meeting with finders at the National Museum, obviously that only really caters to those who are local to Edinburgh. We haven't been able to really expand out very much, although I'm hoping that will change in the coming months. What we are doing at the moment is having conversations with museums across Scotland, assessing their capacity, whether they are able to take in finds on our behalf, whether we can deposit finds with them for finders to pick up, and how we can coordinate that between ourselves and those local museums. So hopefully we will have more options going forward, but we're still very keen and cautious about meeting too many people in one go. So it's unlikely that we'll resume our normal finds days until at least next year, if not the year after. We also, from time to time, manage to get out to some of the find spots so we can excavate the site. Sometimes this is due to an in situ hoard that has been discovered and fortunately left in the ground, or sometimes we suspect there might be more to find. Can we find the original deposit, the hole that was dug in which these objects were buried? Luckily, we have been able to continue this work during the pandemic because fortunately, we're outside, although we do have to be much more cautious on site than previously. Now you can see pictured here a few instances, 3 of which actually took place during the pandemic. The top left is most typical for us. We'll have a small trench. The detectorists will be on site helping us, pinpointing signals so that we can keep an eye out for any objects as we dig down. And as you can see, it's quite a small scale dig. We are very much focusing on the hoard, if that is what we're digging up, the objects in the ground. We're not doing a full-scale excavation of the field. We're not exploring much beyond that immediate find spot. In the bottom left, we have a more unusual case, the Peebles hoard found last year, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It is a hoard of Bronze Age horse and wagon gear with this beautiful sword placed on top. And we're very lucky that the finder stopped digging when he did, because there is so much organic material preserved in this hoard. If he'd have exposed some of that, we could have lost it. So really great that we were able to go out, and you can see some of our NMS colleagues there. Really great that we were able to go out and excavate it. Although we couldn't excavate it fully, we block lifted it and it's currently being processed as we speak. Bottom right, a slightly more unusual situation where we've got a digger involved, and you can see a much larger trench, if you can call it that. We've taken off the topsoil from quite a significant area of the field, and that was because we had a hoard that was scattered and we weren't too sure where the initial deposit was, so we had to open up a larger area, and we were lucky that we were able to do that at that site. And in the top right, pre-pandemic, a very unusual hoard for us. The metal detectorist followed this lovely trail of coins to the bottom of the tree, and it turns out that the hoard was buried directly underneath it, in amongst the large roots. So we were called in to have a look. We were lucky that we were able to get into the tree in such a way that we could actually pull the coins out in a systematic manner. And they were also buried in this lovely ceramic vessel, which unfortunately had been shattered by the tree roots, unsurprisingly. But we were able to do something with it, although it was a very difficult situation to deal with. And as I said, we have been able to do this during the pandemic, which has been great. We like to take the opportunities when we can to avoid these sites being lost through ploughing in particular. And so we are able to get out and about, which has been great. And here is a slide of lots of lovely finds, just to give you an idea of the sorts of things we see. Now, what isn't included on here are ceramics, lithics, textile. We do see those kinds of objects from time to time, but most of the people who are reporting finds to us are metal detectorists. So of course, what we see is a lot of metal. Most finds we see are copper alloy or copper of some kind. We do see a bit of silver, we see a lot of lead, and every so often we get a lovely bit of gold. Fairly rare for us, we don't see it very often, particularly ancient gold, although I'll have some images in a second that of some Bronze Age gold to have a look at. But I hope that this slide just gives you a general idea of the sorts of objects we're looking at. This is by no means exhaustive. We see all sorts of objects of all ages. We're looking at finds from the Mesolithic, the Neolithic, all the way down to 100 years old. And we're looking at significance of those objects. Are they finds that should be recorded? Are they nationally significant? Are they locally significant? How should we deal with these objects? So what we're dealing with and claiming is not all gold and silver, but rather objects that are significant at those different levels of significance. So now I'll go into a bit more information about something we have been doing during the pandemic and something we have been able to do remotely. Our new case management system is now up and running, something that we've been developing for the past 12 months or so. And this is something that we're now using every day. This you won't have noticed at all as finders. At the moment, it is just back of house, something that we're using. But eventually, we're hoping that this will feed into our public database. Now, some of you may have seen the new website and may have seen the button for the database. It's not live yet for a couple of reasons, but that's something that we're working towards, hopefully by the end of the year. Now, the reason why it's not live at the moment is, firstly, there's still a few tweaks for us to make sure it functions the way that we want it to function. And we can't do that until there is data to test it. As we've been working from home and not processing fines very often, there hasn't been much data sitting on that case management system to test the public database. Now that's changing every day. Now that we are back in the office more often, we're able to add artifacts onto the case management system, and we are able to do a bit more, but there's still, as I said, some tweaking to be done. We also want our historic data to sit on this database. So our previous database is an access database. We've been using that since 2010. We'd like to translate those records into something usable on the public database, and that's going to take time. We wanted to ensure that when we do make the database live, that there is actually something on there for people to look at. That it's not just a couple of cases from those new objects that we've been recording, but rather that there is some of our historic data sitting on there as well. Tidying up that data, unfortunately, it takes time. But again, I'm hopeful that by the end of this year, we'll be able to launch it. It won't be complete, it won't have everything on there straight away, but it will be a work in progress, and we'll be adding more and more data to it as we go along. So something really positive that has come out of the past 18 months or so, and something that is really going to make a difference to our working. Hopefully we'll be streamlining it, and hopefully will mean that we can work more remotely than we have been working previously. But now let's move on to some exciting finds from Highland. Now, the image on screen of the pinhead is a Highland find, but not what I'm going to be talking about today, but still, nonetheless, a really exciting object. But moving to some other Bronze Age objects, I first wanted to talk about these lovely gold penannular rings. Two of them, one was allocated to Nairn Museum, the other to Dunbeef Heritage Centre. Two very different looking rings, but of a similar date, as you can see, although one is slightly older than the other. The reason why I wanted to talk about this is because, as I mentioned earlier, gold is fairly rare for us to see. So when we get it in, it's quite exciting. And here are two very good examples of that. Gold is beautiful when it comes out the ground. It doesn't tarnish, it doesn't corrode like most other metals do. So it is really beautiful and shiny. Although, as you can see, both of these have been damaged. So in the top example, I hope that you can see the stripes along the interior of the ring, and that's been done with two different coloured golds. So one of those shades for the main part, the main sheet, the other painted on to create this striped effect. And it's likely that the second gold has a bit more silver content, and that's why you have that slightly different colour. The bottom example isn't striped in the same way, but perhaps you can see, particularly near the terminals, the sort of striped effect, and that's actually been created by score lines and quite deep notches. So it kind of looks stripy, but it's not done in the same way. Now, I don't know if these have been intentionally added to the sheet to create a bit of a stripy effect, or if actually it is so that the sheet can wrap around this ring more easily. I don't know, but I think it's interesting looking at the way that this one has been formed compared to the previous one with the different coloured gold. What I also like about the bottom right is how the sheet has been folded around the terminals. Now, unfortunately, you can't quite see that, but trust me when I say in person, you can see that the ends have been folded so carefully. It's almost like a present, really beautifully, neatly folded. And I don't know why, but that's just quite a lovely thing about this one. Now, as I mentioned, both of them are damaged, which is unfortunate, but what it has meant is that we could see the cores of the ring. So the top example is a copper or copper alloy core. That's what we would expect of rings like this. But the bottom right one is slightly unusual, a bit rarer, in that it has a clay core with a copper or copper alloy layer between the clay core and between the gold sheet. Now, why this is, we're not too sure. Is it adding weight? I don't know. It's really rare, it's really unusual, and something that perhaps we wouldn't have investigated further if we didn't have that damage on the side. We would perhaps have just assumed that it was a copper core or copper alloy core, just like most of the others are. Two really beautiful examples of penannular rings. And I should also mention, we're not too sure what the function of these rings are. There's still a lot of debate about that. So I can't unfortunately tell you, but various thinking is that they are tress rings, one in the hair, they're earrings of some kind, nose rings, something like that, but clearly they are decorative in some way. So unfortunately, no answers here, but still two lovely examples. And now I want to move on to this medieval harness pendant, a little bit later in date, but also a lovely preservation of enamel on this harness pendant. It's unfortunate that we have lost a little bit of it. We've also lost what I think would have been silver from the decoration as well, but it's still in good enough condition that we can tell what the arms are. And this is the arms of the de Bohun, Earls of Hereford, Essex, and later Northampton. And as you can see, it was allocated to Inverness Museum and Art Gallery. Now, unfortunately, we can't associate this with a particular individual in the family. Arms are hereditary, so they are passed down through the family, and therefore we can't say if there's a particular individual that is associated with this harness pendant. We also have to bear in mind how the harness pendants were used, so it's not just the individual de Bohun who would have had this, but also those who are his allies would have had them as well. There were a few prominent de Bohuns in Scotland in the 13th and 14th century, but unfortunately we can't narrow it down any further than that. What I like about these harness pendants is just how exciting they would be, how blingy they would have been. As I said, I think the silver is missing from this one, so you can just imagine how shiny it would be with that beautiful blue coloured enamel. And then you'd have a number of them on the harness as well, so not only shiny but also the jangling as the horse walked. So quite potentially quite a spectacle, I think. That's what I like to think anyway. So it is quite exciting when we get this kind of harness pendant in, where we can actually identify the arms and who this was associated with potentially. So a really lovely example. I believe we have another example of the same arms, the arms of the de Bohun Earls of Hereford, Essex, and later Northampton in the office at the moment, although I'm not sure where that was found. Next, we have some of these, some Roman finds, the Romano-British copper alloy plate and fantail brooch at the top, and then at the bottom, the Roman denarii. And I'm going to start with the denarii. As you can see, they are very green in colour. Denarii are silver coins, so a little bit unexpected perhaps, but I believe what happened here is that any copper in these coins has sort of leached out in the soil conditions, and has given the coins quite a nice green patina. They are silver though, they are denarii. I don't believe that they are forgeries or contemporary copies or anything like that. I think they are denarii, but again, slightly unusual to be green in colour. The top Romano-British brooch though is quite a lovely thing. So hopefully you can see on the slide the enamel design on the disc. It's quite worn, unfortunately, and same on the fantail, but you can just about see this sort of swirly, this whirligig pattern with the yellow enamel. There's also red enamel on here, which unfortunately I don't think you'll be able to see on the slide, but it is present as well. So really lovely object in fairly good condition, considering it's unfortunately lost the pin and the catch plate, but is otherwise complete. The enamel has been lost and sort of dulled a little bit in the soil, which is unfortunate, but still we can see enough to talk about it, which is great. Now, what I like about this brooch is that I said it's Romano-British, and it's a Roman type of brooch, so something that they brought with them, but the decoration is distinctly Celtic. So it really is this mashup of culture in this brooch. Clearly a form that's liked by the Iron Age audience, but again, a Roman style of brooch. So a really interesting mix there and a really lovely object. And as you can see, that was allocated to Grome House Museum. And lastly, I wanted to mention these annular brooches. Now, these are quite common finds for us, perhaps a little less exciting than the gold we just saw. But I wanted to demonstrate with this slide just how different these brooches can be. Although they are very common, for us, we record them all the time, I don't think we've ever had any that are exactly the same. So the top left example is quite simply decorated, and actually the frame of it, you can't tell from the image, is quite thin. It's quite a thin metal. The bottom example is quite small in comparison to the other two. We've got the pin surviving, which is great. The frame is round in section, so it's much thicker than the top left example, and you might be able to just about see some kind of decoration on the frame as well. It's very simple, but there is something going on with the frame. And then we have the top right, which is different again. It's a thick frame, but still flat, and you can see the decoration on there is quite elaborate in comparison to the other two. I hope what you can also see is the dating for these three brooches. I've got quite a broad dating period for them. And the reason for this is that there's not really much literature on these kinds of brooches. The brooch type is used in Britain, but it survives much longer in terms of use in Scotland. So we get these kinds of brooches all the time. Usually in this sort of condition, sometimes we see fragments, sometimes we just see the pins, but we get them through quite a lot. And we have this amazing corpus of annular brooches that hasn't really been looked at. And one of the things that I hope with the new case management system and public database is that we'll be able to see more patterns with these brooches, perhaps a regional pattern, perhaps a more local pattern. Can we identify certain workshops? Are they all individual, or can we find brooches that are the same or very similar? What is actually going on with the annular brooches in particularly Highland, where we find them, obviously the Highland brooch. But what about elsewhere in Scotland? So are there other areas that we see an abundance of these brooches, or is it just Highland? What else can we say about them? I think there's an opportunity here for a lot more work to be done, and perhaps we can narrow down those dates a little bit more depending on the manufacturer or the design of these brooches. What I will also say is, and this goes for most of the finds that come through Treasure Trove, is they're usually found in unstratified layers. So where an archaeological excavation may be able to tell you a date of a find based on the stratigraphy, we don't usually have that here. So it is very difficult for us to narrow down dates. For those objects that aren't obvious, like the Roman coins, like the penannular, the Bronze Age penannular rings. So things like this become very difficult for us to date. But perhaps going forward, someone will take a shine to this this corpus, and we'll do a bit of work on them, and perhaps give us more of an idea of the dates for these fines. So I'm just going to leave that out there, and if anybody's interested in looking at these further, then please drop me an email. And I'm going to finish my talk there. There are many fines that I haven't spoken about that have been allocated to Highland museums. I've only highlighted a few. If you want to learn more about Treasure Trove and the Treasure Trove process, then please go to our website, treasuretrovescotland.co.uk. You can follow us on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you have any questions that have been prompted by this talk, then please drop me an email at treasuretrove@nms.ac.uk. And thank you very much for listening.